Hello and welcome to another episode of Exploring Standards. I am your host, Jess, and today I'm welcoming back on the show Rob Clements from Assent Management. Rob, how are you today?
Jess, yeah, very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. So obviously, Rob, you've been on the show quite a few times now. For those who are just tuning in for the first time to the podcast, Rob is CEO and Director of Assent Risk Management, and he's done a variety of episodes on the podcast all throughout the seasons. This season, we've got an episode about ISO. Um, We've got an episode about ISO 27001 and we look at the top 5 conformances. That's a really good episode. So you can go and check that out. But today we are looking at the evolution of ISO consultancy. So obviously over the years it's changed quite a lot. We've been in this industry, I should say, I've been in this industry for, I want to say 20 years now or thereabouts. Is that correct?
Yeah, over 20 years, yeah, long time.
Over 20 years now, we're aging, Rob. And obviously, Rob, you've seen kind of how it's developed over the years. So let's go straight in with kind of how you got into consultancy and what you sort of first noticed as you entered the industry.
Yeah, it's interesting to look back actually, and I do think there's some value in looking at how things have evolved. It's not just boring for people like us that love ISO. Yeah, I came into the industry from IT actually. So traditionally, a lot of ISO consultants were from the world of quality, because quality management was sort of the first sort of big ISO standard. ISO 9001 still is very big, still the biggest one out there. That's kind of where it started, and traditionally it was in kind of the manufacturing and construction and those kind of industries. Over time, that standard's evolved as well. But I came into it from an IT background when they were starting to look at standards for information security. With the growth of the internet, that became a need. And so the standards people obviously responded to that and started to build the standard. I would have had a slightly different perspective on ISO standards and management systems and how they're applied to some of the others. But I think at the time that was quite useful. Obviously now it's a much more diverse market out there. There's lots of different consultants doing different things, which I think is really good for the industry. But I got into it because one of our clients, clients, was asked by their customer to have ISO 20 had just been made into an international standard at that point. So I had to learn very quickly what it was all about and learn from our mistakes, and made us a better consultancy off the back of it.
That's fab. Thank you. So obviously, you said you had to learn quite quickly about the project, about ISO. So tell us a little bit, sort of how you approached that first project, the first implementation of ISO 27001, and then also like reflect on how that sort of changed today as well.
So I think people learn all the time anyway, and we're still learning as a consultancy, and we're still building that into our projects. Any learnings we get from our clients, and obviously every client is different. Back then, so sort of 20 or so years ago, we already had a good grounding in IT and we had a technical perspective. But what we needed to get our head around was how management systems are put together. And again, that can be different from company to company. I think in those days, paperwork was a lot heavier. So there's a lot more documentation that you needed, a lot more mandatory documentation in the standards. In recent years, ISO have kind of changed that a little bit, and it's more about having documentation that's appropriate to your company, as opposed to having something for the sake of having it, which is obviously a good step. But in those days, it's very document heavy. Also, although obviously we did have the internet 20 years ago, it wasn't the same, it wasn't as fast, and people hadn't adopted it as much. So the first thing we did, and as was common practice back then, is we printed everything out into a ring binder, or actually a couple of ring binders. So we had copies of the management system in paper that the client would have, and they might have that in different parts of their business. So there might be a copy in the office, and there might be a ring binder copy down on the factory floor, for example. And in some ways that was good because you can see everything in front of you and you can make sure everything's there. But of course, when it comes to updating that documentation, it can be difficult. You've got to make sure that you put the updated copy in both places. You've got to take away the old one. You've got to communicate out to everyone that there's a new procedure or something new in there. But generally, that was how it was done. You did have a lot of paperwork. And when it came to the certification audits, we'd bring out the paperwork and our ring binders and other paperwork, other records from the company, and we'd go through them on the table. Obviously, that meant it had to be on site. So you'd always have an auditor sat in front of you and you'd always be going through documents. Not that we ever do this, but if there was an issue with the paperwork, you couldn't easily change it. So it was there for everyone to see. So it was very different to how we work now. I think the other thing from a consultancy perspective, and obviously I knew some other consultants at that time as well, I think ownership of the system was a little bit different. These management systems, that it is the client's systems, it's their business and it's their system of managing their business. But in those days, I think there was much more control that the consultant had, because the consultant would obviously have would mostly have the digital copies of the paperwork, which meant you had to come back to the consultant to update them. There was just, in my opinion, it wasn't the case in every situation, but often there was an ownership sort of issue, I think, where the company didn't necessarily own or feel ownership of the system. Obviously, we as a company always tried to give them that ownership and make sure that they adopted the policies, procedures that they needed to, and we would always happily send them the digital copies if they wanted to change anything. But actually, clients didn't tend to want to do that because I guess maybe they felt that having a consultant, that was kind of what you were there for, right? And I think that's another thing that's changed, I think, since those days is that ownership. I think what we see now is clients do take more ownership of the system. They recognise it's their thing to manage. They recognise it's their business and they want to make it work for them and not just have a consultant tell them how something's done. People want to understand more now, why are we doing this? What does the standard say and what is the spirit behind it? Not just blindly following what everyone else does, but try and make it work for the business. So again, I think that's a positive step there.
Do you think with the ownership, do you think with the way it's changed and what you perceived has changed, that businesses are now kind of taking more ownership and having risk management employees and resources rather than outsourcing it to consultants like ourselves?
Possibly. I think it depends on the size of the company, right? And I think consultants sit probably somewhere in the middle generally, because smaller firms tend to do everything themselves. And, we were a good example of that ourselves. When we were smaller, we did everything ourselves. And then when companies get very large, obviously they've got the resources to hire people, either a compliance manager or even a team of people to manage their compliance across different disciplines. It might be health and safety and environment and quality and information security. And that kind of makes sense for them. I think where consultants sit mostly is somewhere in the middle, because we provide not only knowledge and experience of the standard, so we can help clients avoid any pitfalls and get the job done quicker, but also we provide some resource, right? So without taking away ownership from the client, we can draft documentation and send it to them and just give them a head start. I think there's always, when we're working with a client, there always has been, and there still is, a key contact, so like a coordinator or someone that you tend to speak to. But I think nowadays, with clients taking more ownership of their management systems, we tend to see other people in the business more often. Whereas back in the old days and the paperwork days, we would just probably see one person and they would do everything. And the link back to their management might not have been as strong. The communication channels might not quite have been in the same way they are now. So I think that's a positive. And with technology, it's much easier, right? With Teams or Google Meet or whatever platform you use, you can easily bring people in for a short 10-minute discussion and they drop out. So I think it's much better now to involve the whole business.
Yeah, I think that kind of draws again on the point that you're talking about. Before, it was very much like almost copy and paste. It wasn't as personalized to the business, your management system. Whereas I think now, as you were saying, it definitely is a lot more personalized to business. Businesses are taking it on as their own and adapting it to their needs more. So obviously you mentioned that, with Teams and the internet and Google Shared Drives, it's been making ISO more accessible, I suppose you could say, and easier to manage. So can you talk us through sort of a bit more how software and technologies have improved ISO consultancy and management?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's been huge changes there, and it's still an area that's fast moving and changing rapidly. And I think the last 20 years is probably a good time frame to look at that, because if you go back to, as we said, where we started, and it was very paper heavy and ring binders, the next evolution of that would have been to have a shared drive somewhere. So Dropbox came in, Google Drive, those kind of things. And that allowed us to share documentation with the client on a long-term basis. So it's not just emailing it to them, but it's always sat on that drive and both parties can access. I think really that was the beginning of clients taking more ownership of their stuff, because they could go in and access what they needed, or they can make changes, and we could collaborate together over those platforms. So that was a key step. And then obviously more recently, there's software solutions coming into the market, which tend to be specific to particular standards, although there's some that kind of do multiple standards. But that's becoming more of a feature of ISO systems. I think those software platforms work for many people. There's still many people that like to have more control over their system, and they're more likely to use something like SharePoint, or other platforms are available, but something that is within their tenancy that they control. So there is sort of a balance there. But again, the fact that clients are even having these discussions and these considerations just shows that ownership improvement, how clients are taking more ownership of it.
So obviously these ISO softwares are fantastic, and they're going to, they are helping obviously our clients, but are they actually saving time and obviously therefore money, and what are the pros and cons of using them, and how can we help?
Yeah, I think certainly technology in general, so software and your kind of Microsoft 365 stuff and your Zooms and all of those, and even Dropbox, are helping to save time compared to the old way of doing it, paper folders and all that kind of stuff, for sure. I think it's much quicker now to implement a standard, especially with a consultant's help. It's certainly cheaper in terms of people's time, because we can use these remote technologies, for example. So that cuts down on travel, which saves time and money. It means we can jump onto calls. It means we can do work outside of those consultancy sessions to move projects along. So I think generally technology has really benefited compliance and ISO standards. However, it is still a management system for the client to run, right? I think that's the one thing that we always try to communicate to our potential clients before they come on board, is we can help a lot, and we can take a lot of the burden of producing these documentations and things, but they still need someone on their side to sort of run the system, because we're not there every day and we don't have the authority to make decisions in their business and to affect change in the same way. And luckily, all of our clients, we have really good relationships with them. But what I do think is interesting is, although clients are taking good ownership of their system, what we are seeing more now is a move towards outsourcing some of those roles to consultancies like ourselves. So we offer an outsourced, and people have for a long time, an outsourced competent person service for health and safety, so access to competent device. One of the main reasons for that is because our consultants have a broader range of knowledge than you might get in one individual in a company. And those services have been around for quite a while, actually, so it's not necessarily new. But that principle of that kind of outsourced service is now moving more into other areas, like information security, where you might have a data protection officer, or into quality management, where you might have a quality manager. And there's some very clear roles and responsibilities that we could take on as an outsourced role and save lots of time and lots of resource for the client, but also how our outsourced service interfaces with the client and the roles and responsibilities that they take on. We're always very clear on that. But just the use of technology, it's much easier and more effective to offer an outsourced service, because, to take any of those examples that I've just mentioned, whether it's a quality manager that's outsourced, or a health and safety manager, or a DPO for data protection, our people here can have access to a lot of the client's data, so we can see their action list and the things that are outstanding on there. We can go in and see who's done their training and who hasn't done their training, and we can really keep the system ticking over for the client in the meantime. Obviously, we still do internal audits and that kind of stuff as well. So that's a common thing. But we were able to provide a lot more support to the client, which means they can focus on what they're good at and they still have full ownership of the system. So we're a role within their company, but we can provide much more support.
Yeah, I think you're completely right there about the support given through the technologies that we have now. There's not someone having to go into the building every time for something. The remote access just makes it so much more easier and so much more streamlined, giving the clients that ownership with the support of ourselves if they need it. So let's look forward at the future now. Obviously, AI is a big thing that's a hot topic right now. So what are we expecting of the future of ISO?
Yeah, I certainly think AI is going to play a part in every business, not just ISO, and it certainly does here. I mean, as a company, we're always changing and adapting. As you know, Jess, from the time you've been with us, there's always new standards to look at, new technologies, and also every client is different and has different needs, and we always learn something from each of our clients as to how we can deliver this better. So it is something that's always evolving. I think the role of AI, there's some obvious benefits to AI, particularly in the documentation space, I think. So lots of people will use AI to draft policies or procedures and things like that. And actually, I think there's a lot of benefit to that because AI can go out into its reference data and look for best practice and then bring that back to the client or to the consultant who can and who must then have a human look at that data and interpret it. I think the danger is to just blindly adopt something that AI gives you because you don't really know where it's come from or if it's understood what you've asked. But I certainly think it speeds things up for consultants and clients. If you need to produce something, you become then more of an editor of that documentation, which I think is generally a good thing. We fairly early on we established an AI policy at Assent because we knew that people would use AI tools and it's not really something you can stop, especially as they're out there for free. So we wanted to have some control over how people were using them rather than stop their use altogether. And obviously, the big thing for us is security. So being careful what data you put into those systems, because although many of them have good policies and they say certain things about how they protect your data, firstly, you just never know for sure, and also even they make mistakes. So we're very careful about making sure no client data goes into those systems, nothing that could identify the client or give any information away. So any use of AI at the moment is very generic. So it's like a generic policy that our humans then adapt for the client. So we've got quite a clear boundary there. I think that will become more prevalent. I think the danger there is for our industry is there could be an increase in consultants working on, let's say, standards or areas of compliance that they're not experts in, but they've got the support of AI to appear as though they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think in some cases that might be fine and they might get away with that. But I think the experience that an ISO consultant can bring or someone that's specialist in their field is really important because there is still a human element to the certification, to the auditing process. And that's something that you can't get from AI. I think it's changed too quickly. So
yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Rob, for joining me on the show today. It's been really interesting to sort of hear the journey that you've been on, kind of entering the business over 20 years ago and kind of where we are now and what we're looking at in the future. As you said, it used to be very paper heavy, and I think that binder folder sort of idea is still quite heavy to a lot of people. That's what they think ISO is, but as you know, it's not anymore, and it has definitely gone more online and more remote, and with AI coming on, it'll be interesting to see where it goes in the future. But thank you for joining me on the show. If you have enjoyed listening to today's episode, please make sure you rate, review and subscribe. It really does help the podcast, and we'll be back with an episode in a couple of weeks.